Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Denny Thompson, IOU president, and thanks for joining us for another Zoom presentation by IOU. Tonight, Tyler Harms is going to tell us what happened to 3 billion birds that have left us since 1970. So that got a lot of publicity, and rightfully so. So, Tyler?
Great. Thanks very much, Denny. Thanks everyone for joining this evening. It's super excited to talk to you about this. As Denny mentioned, perhaps old news for most of us on the presentation, so I will apologize in advance if much of what I discussed tonight is nothing new to you, but I'm hoping what you will take from it towards the end of the presentation is some recommendations for what we can do as birders and concerned conservationists to help maintain our bird populations into the future. So again, thanks very much for joining. I think we're going to take questions in the chat. So if you have questions that come up throughout the presentation this evening, feel free to type those in the chat. And if you would just type question and then a dash or a colon, that way Cecile, our moderator, can quickly identify those questions in the chat. So let's get started. What I wanted to do this evening was to first talk a little bit about the importance of birds to us. And, that's probably a pretty simple topic, I think, for most of us on this call, or on this presentation, because I'm sure if you're listening in, obviously birds are important to you in some way. And then we'll talk about are disappearing birds and how we know that based on the study that was published in 2019, and then a little bit about which birds are most in trouble. And then I'll close the presentation this evening with some recommendations for what we can do about it. Now, I'm sure if many of you are familiar with the study that was published that we'll talk about this evening, they did also provide their own list of recommendations, and that's certainly a great list that we'll discuss briefly. But I wanted to take it a step further and talk a little bit more about what we can do locally as Iowans to help things along. I wanted to start off first by just asking this simple question of who has a favorite bird. And again, I know we're all birders on this presentation, so undoubtedly everyone has a favorite bird, and I'm sure if we went around and mentioned what those were, we might hear some folks mention some common local species that we see every year, like perhaps the red-winged blackbird or the American robin, that I think all of us probably see as the harbingers of spring and birds that get us excited about warm weather after the long winter season. Perhaps it's some of our common feeder birds, like a black-capped chickadee or a downy woodpecker. I do a lot of work with kids, and oftentimes these are some of their favorite birds because they have bird feeders in their backyards, and they're the birds that they see frequently. And so it's easy to understand why some of these feeder birds might be their favorite. Or maybe it's one of our more charismatic species in Iowa, like the great horned owl, or in my case, the trumpeter swan. One of my favorite birds that we see here in Iowa, and certainly one of the neat conservation success stories that we can be proud of here in Iowa and throughout the Midwest. So we all obviously have favorite birds, and I think that's probably at least one testament to the fact that all of us care a lot about birds. Well, we're not alone. There are a number of people across the U.S. that like watching wildlife and more specifically enjoy watching birds. In 2016, a survey conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that's conducted every 5 years in the U.S. found that 1/3 of the U.S. population reported watching wildlife. So if you are having a hard time recalling what the U.S. population is, it's currently about 330 million people. And so do the math, that's about 100 million people that reported watching wildlife. Of those, about 43.8 million, you can see on the figure on the right, reported watching wildlife around their home, and 88% of those folks reported watching birds around their home. Wildlife watchers increased by 20% between when the survey was conducted in 2011 and the survey in 2016. And this is actually quoted in the survey report. Birds attracted the greatest following of any wildlife species in 2016. So we all obviously like birds a lot, and they're very important to us, but this is some pretty sound and solid evidence to suggest that there are a number of people across the US that like birds as well, which provides some reason for why we should be concerned about the study that we'll be talking about tonight. So since the 2016 report was published, there's been a lot of science looking at trying to tease out why people like birds so much. And this is a study conducted by Daniel Cox and Kevin Gaston. In 2016, it was published in the scientific journal called PLOS ONE. And what they tried to look at was what motivates people to enjoy birds, and more specifically, what motivates them to feed birds. And the results on this figure might be a bit challenging to interpret, but essentially what you can see is the top bars in each of these boxes are, or at least in the top two boxes, are people that don't feed birds. And then the bottom two bars are people that feed birds either irregularly or regularly around their house. And then on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis here, you can see the varying responses that those individuals reported, from on the far right being strongly agree to the far left being strongly disagree. And essentially what you can see there is that people that both fed birds irregularly and regularly around their homes reported greater psychological benefits, greater awareness of welfare issues, and also greater nature orientation than individuals that did not feed birds. And so you can see that feeding birds has a variety of benefits for that can be specific to different individuals, which is another reason why we should really care about these birds that are declining. This was a quote from that study by Cox and Gaston in 2016. They said, "Feeding birds may provide an important tool for engaging people with nature to the benefit of both people and conservation." Essentially, what that says is that birds are important to us. They're important as vehicles for conservation messaging, and they, perhaps most importantly, are a great tool for engaging people and helping them care about not only bird conservation, but conservation of natural resources more broadly. So as I think many of you know, I'm the executive director of Iowa Young Birders, one of the very fortunate positions that I hold, in that I get to show birds to kids once a month throughout the year, which is a ton of fun. And several individuals on the presentation tonight have either helped with field trips in the past or supported our programs through other means. And so I'm very appreciative to all of you for your continued support. In 2019 or 2020, actually, excuse me, the summer after the pandemic started, we initiated what we called a summer birding program, where we encouraged kids to log hours and time spent participating in bird-related activities throughout the summer months when they were not in school. If any of you are familiar, have had kids or grandkids participate in summer reading programs organized by public libraries, this is more or less the same thing. We had about 200 kids participate in the summer birding program that year, and we followed up with them after the program was complete and asked them some questions about how their experiences from the program helped them develop into birders and conservation leaders. And what these two figures show here is that the vast majority of kids that participated in our program reported an increased enjoyment of the outdoors after participating in the summer birding program, and also asked to spend more time outdoors, or at least during the program and after participating in the program. So this is evidence to suggest that indeed birds are tools for getting kids outside, getting them to enjoy the outdoors, and hopefully help them develop a conservation awareness and a passion for birding in the outdoors. Perhaps not surprising to us, birds have a variety of economic benefits as well. As I discussed earlier, wildlife watching has increased in popularity in the last 5 years, and we've seen a corresponding increase in the amount of money spent on wildlife watching activities in the past 5 years. Those expenditures increased 39% between 2011 and 2016, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey. And approximately 75% of all wildlife watchers spent money on equipment or trips, totaling about $160 billion reported in 2016. So a pretty significant economic impact on that wildlife watching has. In a study conducted in Ohio in 2020, they found that annual spending in 6 selected sites was approximately $26 million, which created 283 jobs to local communities, generated 8.9 million in personal income and 1.9 million in tax revenues in local coffers in various communities around Lake Erie. So a really huge economic impact of birds and more specifically bird watching. Birds can also serve as really important tools for pest control. In a study done in 2008 conducted on Jamaica's coffee farms, they essentially simulated an insect infestation on these coffee farms. And what they found was that the proportion of berries infested by insects were greater in areas that had exclosures built around them. So essentially the birds were excluded from these areas versus areas that served as a control. So they were open and they did not have exclosures. So when birds were excluded from coffee plants, there was a greater proportion of plants that were infested by damaging insects. So very obvious benefit to Jamaica's coffee farms. Study conducted in California looked at a very similar situation. In this case, they put bluebird boxes up in vineyards in California's Napa Valley to try to attract western bluebirds. And you can see in the figure on the lower right there that in the vineyards that had active nesting western bluebirds using the boxes, they had a higher proportion of larvae consumed than in the control areas that did not have any nesting western bluebirds. So western bluebirds are extremely beneficial to vineyards in that they're removing a high number of insect larvae that can be problematic for the plants. So a pretty interesting economic benefit of birds that I'm not sure that many of us always think about, but they do provide both economic and ecological services to us. And then lastly, many of us are familiar with the famous book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that was one of the first publications that really brought to our attention the benefit of birds as ecological indicators. To briefly summarize Silent Spring, Dr. Carson talked a lot about the impacts of the chemical DDT on various bird species, particularly American robins and other urban birds, where this chemical was being used quite frequently for controlling urban insect populations. They were experiencing large die-offs of urban birds, and then also found that DDT was causing eggshell thinning in a number of our raptor species, which contributed largely to their population declines, the bald eagle being one in particular. We also know that common loons can be a very robust ecological indicator for water quality, and a species that nests on lakes throughout our northern neighbor in Minnesota and some other states to the north, that they monitor very closely, in particular for water quality. And then lastly, birds are a great indicator of simply habitat quality. And I like to use the quote from the famous movie Field of Dreams: "If you build it, they will come." And I think that that's a very good quote when we think about what birds can tell us about habitat restoration and habitat management on our landscape. So birds are obviously very important. I think we established that. But as we discussed here early in the presentation, our birds are in trouble. And it's something that we need to be concerned about as birders and bird conservationists, and something that we need to help others realize as a very important aspect of the future of conservation in our nation. So Ken Rosenberg from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology published this study in 2019. It was published in Science, and as Denny mentioned, it made a pretty big splash in the media. So I'm sure many of you have heard about this first ever comprehensive assessment of nesting bird populations in the US and Canada. And what this study found was some pretty staggering across the board declines in our North American bird populations. 3 billion birds is the number, or the phrase that we've often heard in the news, and that's because the study found that approximately 3 billion birds have disappeared from North America and Canada since 1970. One of the most devastating documented losses of bird populations in history. Oh, there we go. So how did they determine this? They assessed population trends of 529 bird species across the US and Canada. They used population trends from citizen science projects such as the Breeding Bird Survey and the Christmas bird count. So I'm sure many of us participate in one or both of these citizen science programs, and so we can feel proud to know that the data we helped collect on an annual basis was used in this study to document these declining trends. And what they did with those population trends from the BBS and CBC was took already established population metrics for these different species that have been published by organizations like Partners in Flight or the National Audubon Society. They took those estimates and then used the trends from these surveys to kind of project out what the population would be from 1970 to today, based on the original population estimates and the trends. They analyzed these trends by individual species, and then they also analyzed these trends by ecological groups. So think grassland birds, forest birds, wetland birds. And they did this across 48 years, from 1970 to 2018. And what they found, I think, which was perhaps surprising to most of us, was that we often hear about birds that are somewhat rare on our landscape. Species like maybe a Henslow sparrow or some of our other grassland bird species that we don't really see everywhere, but if we know where to look for them, we can find them. We've often heard about the perils of those bird species, driven largely by habitat loss. But what was perhaps surprising to most of us was that even some of our common species that we see at our backyard bird feeders have experienced some pretty drastic declines. 25% of blue jays have been lost since 1970, 25% of rose-breasted grosbeaks, almost a third of our Baltimore orioles have been lost. Species like dark-eyed juncos and white-throated sparrows that we enjoy in the winter but nest further north, a 1/3 of those species have been lost since 1970. So it's not just the species that we commonly hear about, perhaps facing some threats due to habitat loss or others. It's our more common species as well. What this figure shows from the study is how those declines break down across those various ecological groups that they evaluated. Grassland birds seeing the greatest decline since 1970. Almost 50% of our grassland bird species, or 3/4 of the species, are experiencing pretty severe population declines. You can see how they break down with among the other groups, but really, if you look at these black bars, which are the 95% credible intervals, which are essentially a measure of precision on these estimated declines, we can see that there are only 3 groups of birds: Arctic tundra birds, coastal birds, and wetland birds, that are either experiencing effectively no change, which means that this black confidence bar is overlapping 0, or increasing in the case of our wetland birds. All other groups of birds are experiencing some level of decline that is approximately 20% or greater. And again, this just shows how those declines look among the different ecological groups. So our aerial insectivores, we've lost approximately 160 million individuals since 1970. That's about a 32% population decline. Our grassland birds, not surprising to many of us, 53% population loss since 1970. More broadly, our migratory birds in general, species like Baltimore orioles and rose-breasted grosbeaks, almost a 30% population decline. And then our eastern forest birds experiencing 17%. And the list goes on, and you can find a number of these really neat figures on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, or actually the study itself has its own website. It's called 3billionbirds.org, and you can find more information there as well. So one of the, I think, more interesting things about this study is that they also looked at NexRad radar data to essentially serve as a validation tool for the declines that they were documenting using the Breeding Bird Survey and Christmas bird count trend analyses. So many of us as birders, I'm sure, are familiar with the great utility of weather radar for tracking migratory birds across North America. And what you might not be aware of is that scientists have actually developed tools for analyzing these data to try to estimate cumulative migratory movements on different nights throughout the migratory season. And that's effectively what the second component of the study did. They used NexRad radar from, I believe, 148 different radar stations across the United States. They analyzed these data from 2007 to about 2018, so not quite as long of a time range as the trend analysis, but what they found was pretty similar to what they found with the trend analysis, in that we've seen a 14% decline in migratory passage since 2007. So that's now, what, 15 years, and we're seeing about a 1% decline in migratory passage per year. So many of us might be thinking, how in the world could we lose 3 billion birds in about a 48-year time span? And I'm sure many of us also probably have heard of the story of the passenger pigeon, which is a famous species for not so great reasons. The passenger pigeon once numbered in the 3 to 5 billion individuals across the eastern US. So not even spanning the entire US, but just in the eastern forests of the United States. You can read accounts from some of the early explorers and settlers that talk about stories of flocks so large that they would block out the sun, that they would be miles wide and go on for hours. These birds were just extremely abundant at the time of settlement, and yet they're now extinct. And so they were and they went extinct largely due to overexploitation and other threats that were caused largely by us. And so this is a good example of a species that, and this was a single species. This was not 524 species across the U.S. This was a single species that we drove to extinction in a very short period of time that was extremely abundant. So so we have the capability of doing this, unfortunately, but I think with some careful measures and some thoughtful measures, we can keep from doing this again. So let's talk a little bit about that. What can we do to help curb these population declines, and what can we do to make sure that our birds are around for us to continue to enjoy and for future generations as well? Well, as I mentioned, the study itself has published what they're calling 7 simple actions to help birds. And if you look at that list, something might become pretty evident pretty quickly, and that is that a lot of the things that they recommend there are due to threats that are not surprisingly caused by us. So making windows safer. We lose a vast majority of birds every year due to window collisions. Keep cats indoors. Less lawn and plant natives is another one. So planting native plants in your yard. Avoid using pesticides. Drink shade-grown coffee. We know that a number of our migratory bird species are spending their winter months on coffee plantations in Central and South America, and those plantations can have some pretty drastic effects on habitat in the South, much like agriculture can here in the Midwest, which is what we're much more familiar with. And so drinking shade-grown coffee can help conserve some of those habitats used by our birds on the wintering grounds. And then other things like using less plastic and watching birds and continuing to contribute to citizen science to help track our bird populations. So all great things that I think we all can do to some extent to help our birds in the future. But what I wanted to do was to kind of augment those 7 simple steps with a handful of additional steps that I think we as birders here in Iowa can do locally to help the birds that we love here in our state and that are passing through our state. And the first thing is to support habitat conservation. Again, if you build it, they will come. If we put habitat on the ground, birds will utilize it. I have a really neat example that helped me realize just how true that statement is. There's a small little 80-acre wetland and grassland complex in Story County, which is where I live, that was restored by Story County Conservation. It's called the Roland Wildlife Area, and I think it was first restored in 2016, perhaps, somewhere in there. It was previously an ag field. Again, 80 acres, not a real large area, but was restored to kind of a prairie pothole wetland complex. And Story County Conservation asked that I conduct bird surveys at the site a few years after they had restored the site. And in my 3rd year of conducting surveys at this area that was previously a crop field, I had 2 different Henslow sparrows singing on 2 different survey periods throughout the summer. So a species that we often think of as being pretty particular and picky in terms of what they need for habitat. And here this species is showing up on an area that was just recently restored and was once an ag field. Obviously not going to be using that area if it remained as an ag field. And so habitat conservation is a very, very powerful tool to help with supporting our bird populations, and supporting habitat conservation is something that we all can do. Obviously, we all might not have habitat that we can restore or conserve, but what we can do is donate to our favorite habitat organizations. Organizations like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited. Here in Iowa, we have the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. We have county conservation boards. We have our Department of Natural Resources, a variety of different organizations that are funding boots on the ground habitat work in our state, and we can help support those efforts by donating to these organizations. I know this is a topic that often comes up among Iowa birders, is purchasing a federal duck stamp. The duck stamp has been around since 1937. It's required of all waterfowl hunters in order to hunt waterfowl in the United States. But what we know is that almost dollar for dollar, the proceeds from the duck stamp go directly back into restoring and managing wetland and grassland habitats in the United States and Canada. And so whether some of you might be a waterfowl hunter, perhaps you're not, some of you might already purchase a duck stamp. If you don't, I would encourage you to do so, because that is one way in which we can support habitat conservation for our bird species here in Iowa. Maybe you're not interested in donating to habitat organizations or purchasing a duck stamp. Another thing that you can do is get yourself a natural resources license plate. We have a handful of different license plates here in Iowa. I think many of you are familiar with the Goldfinch license plate that's been around for a very long time. And since then, the Department of Transportation has added a handful of others as well. And these license plates exist in a variety, in a number of states throughout the Midwest and across the United States. And oftentimes what these plates do is put an additional fee onto the annual registration fee for your vehicle that goes directly back to natural resource organizations. In the case of Iowa, funding from these plates or proceeds from these plates go directly back to the Wildlife Diversity Program of the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, that's then used for various habitat restoration and education activities throughout the state. So that's another way that we can support habitat conservation in Iowa. I mentioned this one already, and this one was on the 7 simple steps that were published by the study, but I'll mention it again, is make your yard bird friendly. Many of us, I'm sure, have bird feeders, and perhaps we've gone the extra mile in creating some habitat for our birds around our feeders. But this can be a really simple yet powerful way in which we all can contribute to bird conservation. And yeah, perhaps my small little 1/8 of an acre yard in Northeast Ames is, might not move the needle when it comes to nationwide bird populations. But if I can convince all of my neighbors in my neighborhood to do it, then we might be gaining some ground. And so I think that that's the important thing to remember, is that if we do it and others do it as well, collectively, we can start to move that needle. So activities like planting native plants, refraining from using chemicals on your yard, providing food and water, all of those things can help make your yard more bird friendly. Another really interesting study that was published in the journal Biological Conservation in 2017 looked at the proportion of native plants in various yards in the Northeast and how Carolina chickadees were responding to those different yards. And what the figure there shows is that they found, the authors found a higher species richness of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths, in yards with native plants compared to yards with non-native plants. And perhaps not surprisingly, what they also found was that Carolina chickadees then preferred to forage more frequently in yards with native plants than in non-native plants. So you were seeing this correlation between insect diversity and foraging preference of our bird species. Plant native plants, I think, is the moral of the story for that study. Show a kid your favorite bird. Talk to kids about birding. These folks are the future of bird conservation in Iowa and in the nation. And I think that we need to do our best to not only make sure that birds are around for them to enjoy, but to make sure that they are exposed to birds and to help them build that passion for birds and passion for conservation. On average, kids spend about 6 to 8 hours per day plugged in, sitting in front of a screen. That statistic was published prior to the pandemic, and I think what we all know is that we've all spent a lot more time in front of a screen as a result of the pandemic, and our kids included. So we need to do what we can to get them outdoors, to experience birds and birding, to show them how much we love it and how much fun it can be, and that you can do it anywhere. One of my favorite quotes from naturalist Robert Pyle is, "What is the extinction of a condor to a child who has never seen a wren?" If we don't show kids our common birds and help them develop a love for birds, they're not going to develop a passion for conservation of bird species elsewhere. So those are a few additional things. So I guess we'll say now we have 10 simple steps in addition to the 7 that were published by the study that we can do. And much of the presentation tonight has been a bit doom and gloom, I realize, but what I wanted to close with is that all is not lost. Despite these shocking declines in a number of our bird species since 1970, we are also seeing some success stories. Raptors being one group of birds where we've gained 15 million individuals since 1970, likely largely due to changes in policies regarding uses of pesticides and DDT. Waterfowl species have gained 35 million individuals since the 1970s and are experiencing some of the highest numbers for a number of species that they've experienced in recent years, and so that's a great success story as well. And then woodpeckers of all species, 14 million individuals gained in our woodpeckers since 1970. So we do have some success stories out there, and I think you can see here that each one of these images says thanks to conservation efforts. So the conservation efforts that we can implement as concerned citizens and concerned birders are obviously helpful, and they can help to bring our birds back. So again, to summarize, we know that we all love birds and that birds are important to us. But I think one of the important take-homes from my presentation, and something that I always try to remember, is that there are a lot of people out there that might not consider themselves as birders, but do really care about birds and enjoy watching birds and wildlife. And I think that there's a lot of untapped potential there in terms of what we can do to implement conservation on the ground and to help our birds come back. And so I'll leave you with my 11th simple step, and that is to tell your friends. Tell your friends about the importance of birds, about why birds are important to you, and help them realize why they should care about birds as well. Chances are they're probably one of those individuals that like seeing birds around. If you ask them, one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what would you do if birds weren't around? If you couldn't see birds in your backyard, would you care? And oftentimes even the people that I feel like probably don't really care to listen to me talk about downy woodpeckers and black-capped chickadees at my feeders are probably not going to like the fact that they might not be able to see those birds in their yard someday. And so, again, share with them and help them realize the importance of birds and perhaps the importance of what they can do to help. That concludes my presentation this evening. I really appreciate everyone's attention and your participation tonight. Hopefully I provided some new information and maybe some food for thought. So thanks again for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Tyler, I'd just like to put in a little plug here real quickly, that another thing that we can do is get involved in our communities and get them certified as bird-friendly Iowa communities. That's fresh on my mind because it's taken up my life for the last 2 weeks. So if you just go to birdfriendlyiowa.org, there's a lot of resources there for native plants. We're really growing quite a bit.
Thank you for that, AJ. That's a great recommendation. And we're very fortunate to have the Bird Friendly Iowa program here in Iowa. And there's nothing that I enjoy more than driving into a new city or a new county and seeing the Bird Friendly Iowa signs. I just drove through the Waterloo Cedar Falls area this last weekend for an Iowa Young Birders trip and noticed their sign. And it just makes me smile every time I drive past one of those signs. And I think that that's a great recommendation.
Well, and it's a great community effort too. It's a good way to get your friends and neighbors involved.
Absolutely.
Tyler, there is one question in the chat, and it's from Ellen Norman. And she's asking, what are good resources for procuring Iowa native plants?
Oh, that's a great question, Ellen. Thank you for that. Oh, it probably depends on what types of native plants you're looking for. If you're looking for native trees and shrubs, our DNR State Forest Nursery has a number of really great species and packages that you can purchase that have native trees and shrubs. I believe if anyone's on the call is more aware than me, I believe they still are offering what they call their Songbird Pack, which is a small mix of mostly native shrubs and then a handful of native tree species as well that you can purchase to plant in your yards. So that's one really great resource. There are a number of companies and organizations that support native prairie plants in Iowa. Seed Savers Exchange in Northeast Iowa is one that comes to mind. I've acquired some native prairie seeds from them in the past for my yard, and they have a variety of different mixes. And there are other groups and companies in Iowa that support or sell, for that matter, native prairie plants as well. And so I can, if you'd like, Ellen, I can drum up some more of those resources and send them to you. And anyone else on the call here, I know we have a number of very knowledgeable individuals on the presentation tonight. So if any others have recommendations or companies that you've worked for or worked with in the past, please pass those along.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, we're building that library in the resource library for Bird Friendly Iowa of places that have native plants. So
Perfect.
A good place to look.
Thank you, Ann. Yeah, that's going to be a fantastic resource. Other questions?
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining, and big shout out to Tyler for the presentation. Well
Thanks,
worth the
Tyler.
time.
Thank you, everybody. Again, appreciate you attending this evening.